Hello. Good evening. Love looking into this beautiful room and space that we have here. So I am Liz Brailsford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. I am so happy to see all of you. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the 2021 Bill and Barbara Bennett Human Dignity and Human Rights and Fairness for All lecture. Bill, thank you. Thank you so much. Tonight we're thrilled to be partnering with the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Mary Pat, thank you too. And I'd like to thank Caroline Fangman and Annie Black, and of course, Mary Pat again, for all of their hard work in arranging for this program and allowing us to be in this beautiful space. If you are not a member of the World Affairs Council yet, please join us. I would love for you to be a part of our engaged and informed citizenry and membership. And it's the holidays right now, and I really can't think of a better holiday gift than a World Affairs Council membership. So you can check out our website at dfwworld.org to find out more about that. And the council is committed to providing a safe environment within our capabilities for our events, so you can catch up on all of our health and safety practices and see our full event lineup. And I must say, we're starting to release some of our 2022 events. So please check out our website. And again, it's dfwworld.org. Check it out. Join us. Our first event in 2022 is going to be on January 11th. It's at the Doubletree at Love Field, and it will feature Jessica Bedoya. She is the Chief of Staff and Executive Advisor at the Inter-American Development Bank in D.C. She will join us, and she will discuss the future of Central and South America, investing in women, energy, and global supply chain. I really can't think of a more pertinent topic right now. I think it's going to be fabulous. I hope to see you there January 11th. Please join us. Also, we have on Friday, January 28th, please attend our 2022 Dallas Lgbtq Symposium on Equality and Human Rights. That we are partnering with a lot of different organizations in our area, including the museum as well. Thank you again. Mary Pat is part of our steering committee, along with myself and several others. It's an important event. I hope to see all of you here or there. Again, check out our website at dfwworld.org. And just a small reminder before we begin to please silence your cell phones, any other electronic devices. We want to hear every word of this critical conversation we're about to have. This program would not be possible without the generous support of Bill and Barbara Bennett. Woo, that's right. Thank you for helping us continue our mission to engage and educate the North Texas area on all things international and on these important issues that we're about to discuss. We are very fortunate to have you in our membership and our community and our orbit, and we appreciate you. And Barbara. Thank you. This event is just a few days before Human Rights Day, so it's perfect timing. And now I will invite Bill Bennett in just a moment to take the podium to introduce our panel. Bill is the founder and president of the DFW Alliance for Religious Freedom, and also serves as president of Pathway India, an organization devoted to the education and physical and mental rehabilitation of disadvantaged youths and adults in India. He previously held executive positions with global corporations, private equity firms, and as an entrepreneur, and now serves on various nonprofit boards, and they focus on the arts, education, and international affairs. With that, I will welcome Bill to the podium. Thank you again. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's just such a pleasure to be here amongst friends. I think we all know each other. Most of us know each other pretty well, and what a joy to be here. Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it, and I'm so thrilled to be here in this spectacular forum for the talks we're going to have tonight. This is exactly the right place to talk about human dignity and our freedoms and our civil rights. And I'm not going to take long introducing anybody here. Our two people I'm going to introduce are Brett Scharfs, who's been my mentor in religious freedom. He's the director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, has been involved with that organization for about 20 years, and has really taken this message of religious freedom and human dignity across the globe. He's been a professor at various universities around the world. He's worked extensively in Cambodia and Indonesia and India and all sorts of places. And the organization that he's director of holds about, I don't know, Brett, 15 of these meetings per year around the world, all over the place. And I've been so blessed to be involved with him. Most recently in Bologna, Italy, where I was privileged enough to join the G20 interfaith meeting that was held there as part of the G20 summit that's happened in Italy. And Brett and his associate Cole Durham formed that organization about, how many years ago? 2006, when was that? About 5 years ago, they formed that interfaith organization for the G20 group of nations. So wonderful person. He's going to be one of our speakers. The other one is Jaelyn Prince. All these pictures that you're seeing, most of which are in the book, which you've already received, were done by Jaelyn. She's a noted international photographer and photojournalist. She also formed and is the chairman and founder of an organization for autistic children. She's one of the 100 top women in Maryland. Wonderful photographer, amazing works that you've got. I think I counted them. There's 61 photographs in that book that we've given to each one of you, so we're going to talk about the book, we're going to talk about the photos, and with that, I'll turn the time over to Mary Pat, who will introduce the program.
Is this right? Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I'm delighted that the museum is partnering with the Dallas World Affairs Council tonight. I'm so excited to welcome Liz Brailsford into her role, and had the honor of meeting her and showing her this space, and I'm so thankful that you asked us to partner tonight. Tonight's program ties in with an important part of our exhibit, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so it's just an honor to be able to speak to you tonight about this book. So let's get started. I know that everyone has received their very own copy of the book, and I want to thank you, Brett, for that. That was really lovely. And as we'll discuss, the book is based on two important declarations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1948 in the aftermath of the Holocaust, championed by Eleanor Roosevelt and Rene Cassin. And that's an important teaching tool for us in the museum because it emerged in response to the Holocaust to create a human rights framework that was sorely missing during the Holocaust. But we'll also be talking about a new declaration, the Punta del Este Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone, Everywhere, a 2018 declaration reaffirming the UDHR. So when we say UDHR, That's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm sure you all knew that, but I want to make sure. So I would love for Brett, for you to talk us through how the Punta del Este Declaration was created, and what significance it has, and the group that was behind this effort.
Thank you very much, Mary Pat. Let me just begin by thanking the World Affairs Council and the BENIX for the honor of Jaelyn and me being here and being able to discuss our labor of love with you. It's obviously something authors love, which is an opportunity to share their work. And I'd like to begin with two snapshots, and they relate to the two parts of the name of our host organization, the Holocaust and human rights. The first snapshot is one of the most important days of my life. It was March 22nd, 1988, and I was virtually alone in Auschwitz, outside of Krakow, Poland. And it was one of the coldest days I can remember in my life. And I was in that place and seeing just this testimony of what had happened there. Rooms full of spectacles, rooms full of toothbrushes, rooms full of shoes, and the showers that didn't shower water, and the ovens that didn't bake bread. And I was there. It was my 25th birthday. And it's a day I'll never forget, because as I sat in that place, I thought to myself, what can I do in my life to help assure that this never happens again? And I had no idea. That's the first snapshot. Second snapshot is in January of 2018. And I was in the conference room at our center, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University Law School. And we were having a meeting with Jan Fagel, who is the EU, the European Union, Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief. And we were talking about what we might do to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he told us a story. And it totally shaped the direction of what we then spent that year and the years since trying to do. And the story went like this. Few of you have heard me tell this story before. It was that important to me. He's on the phone with the government of Pakistan. And he says, "Hello, this is Jan Fagel, EU Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief outside the EU. I'd like to come visit." And he said, "Can you imagine the reaction?" And we paused, and he said, that was the reaction. There was a long pause, followed by a very tentative and very suspicious, "What do you want to talk about?" And he was ready for this question. He said, "I want to come talk about human dignity and how it's important for all people at all times in all places." And he said there was another pause, but it seemed shorter. And the response seemed markedly different. The voice on the other end of the line said, human dignity, karama in Arabic. That is a very important concept in the Quran, our holy scripture. Why don't you come and we can talk? And he said what this taught him was that human dignity was a concept that was genuinely universal, that it was a concept that could build bridges across cultures and traditions that are mired in mistrust. And he went to Pakistan and he talked about human dignity and religious freedom. And he returned on several occasions for increasingly public and increasingly productive discussions, culminating, well, not culminating, but including negotiating the release of Asia Bibi, who's a name you may recognize. This is a Christian woman, a Catholic, who was a peasant and was working, picking fruit, and drank out of a bucket that was for all of the workers, but she was accused of blasphemy for drinking out of a bucket that was supposedly just for the Muslim women. And she was sentenced to death for blasphemy and served 8 years in prison before finally being released in 2018. And it was Jan Figel's relationship that he had established with the government of Pakistan, sort of the rest of the story that we don't hear about, that really facilitated that release. And so we decided to focus on human dignity. And that year, 2018, together with Jan Figel, we organized 3 conferences, one at Central European University in Budapest, one at Oxford University, and one at our center at BYU Law School, all focusing on the uses of human dignity as a practical tool that could help us address human rights issues. And this culminated in a meeting in Punta del Este, Uruguay, where a group of about 40 scholars and human rights advocates from around the world gathered to negotiate and adopt this commemoration of the UDHR. And what it's really designed to do is to kind of hit the reset button on human rights, which have become politicized, which have become controversial, and occasionally weaponized, and to try to return it to the fundamental foundational principle that made agreement on human rights possible back in 1948, with the hope that in our moment as well, this concept of human dignity can help us create consensus and agreement on human rights.
Wonderful. So let's talk about the creation of the book, how you two came together to join Jaelyn's amazing photos with the Declaration and with all of the wonderful excerpts and statements of the scholars that were at the Declaration. When did you two decide to do this? How did this come to life? Jaelyn, you go first this time.
Well, I received a knock on the door.
Uh-huh.
And who was at the door? It was Brett. And we've known one another for a very long time. In fact, even a wedding reception of 2 people that we have here happened to be at our home. Uh-huh. So we have a long history. And he came with some associates and said, well, we've got this idea, and we've been working on a couple of things. And he had liked the work of somebody. He had liked the work of someone that I had studied with, and that is Steve McCurry. And if you all are familiar with Afghan Girl for National Geographic,
Yes.
I decided that I wanted to work with him several years ago, and so we've traveled the world together, and we've done some other things in New York and so forth. And Brett knew kind of that connection, and then you get to take the rest of this because I'm not certain.
Well, we had used Steve McCurry's photos in a brochure that we had put together highlighting the Punta del Este Declaration. And these brochures were so popular, they were just disappearing. And every time we printed another 1,000, we had to send him royalties. And I thought to myself, we want to do a book, but I don't want to do these crazy royalties. I know one of his students who takes photographs that are in his style and as beautiful and wonderful as his. And just as we're giving you this book tonight, we're not trying to make money on it. We went and asked Jaelyn if she would donate some photographs. And I just absolutely love the photographs that Jaelyn takes. The one on the cover is beautiful, but I just wanted to share with you a couple of my favorites. So if you, hopefully you got a copy of this book on the way in. If you turn to page, well, it's really labeled, it's not labeled, it's page 0. It's the preamble. It's about 6 or 7 pages in, and it's a picture of a man in a turban in front of an elephant. And they're both wearing the same color chalk decoration. Tell us a little bit about that photo, Jaelyn. This is just spectacular.
I would love to. In fact, that's probably the cue for me to explain things with
Well,
the
I
rest
would
of the
love for you
photos.
to tell us about all of the photos that are on the stage.
Wonderful. And let's go to this gentleman right here. He happens to be an elephant driver, and he was taking care of his elephant around the time of Holi. And Holi is, can you hear me now? Is that better? Thank you. I feel like I'm eating it. Thank you. During the time of Holi, which is the beginning of spring, the official beginning of spring in India. And he is interesting, but there's also another picture of a little girl who lives in a garage, an elephant garage, and that's where that elephant was going. And the family home is on one side of an elephant garage.
Oh, my goodness.
And so these huge animals are coming in and out, and there was this little girl about this big that was playing around their ankles and so forth. It's a very interesting and kind of a jarring situation to see something that people would be horrified if, you know, a 4 or 5 year old happened to be playing with a local elephant, you know, around
Right.
here. But I would like to.
I would love for you to tell us a little bit about these photos and why you chose them for the book, what similarities these people have, you know, why you saw them as really representing human dignity.
Wonderful. Well, human dignity is a very interesting question, and photographers have a lot of time to anticipate things because we're traveling between locations. And the idea of what is dignity, is it something that is innate? Is it something that is earned? Is it something that somebody is responsible for themselves to nurture? Is it something that we bestow on others? And who is it that is qualified to bestow the title of being dignified on someone? And the big question is, if it is fragile or however it is obtained, can it be taken away from someone? And those are the huge questions about what human dignity is. And there are ways of working with people to make things salacious or do any one of a number of things, especially through photography. But there's a lot of journalists like myself and a lot of people who have been doing global photography that we tend to see the dignity in people at unusual times and unusual circumstances. And I'll give you just a few things so you get a little bit more of a history. The young mother and child on the far end, she's been part of a work program that was headed by Muhammad Yunus. And she was able to earn her way in helping to provide a livelihood for herself and for her child. And this is a picture of her with great success because she had just been able to pay off her last loan and she was able to have her own independent business. And you can tell her joy and the joy of the child. And then a young fellow who is a merchant in India, and he's trying to figure out his life. And I think he has a whole story in his eyes and trying to figure out, where will I be? He may not be asking consciously that question, but I think it resides in his eyes. This is a young mother. This is one of my favorite photos of any that I've ever taken. And this is in Myanmar. And you talk about genocide. That is happening there now. And it happened to be in the peripheries on the outskirts of Myanmar during the time that we were there. But I think the warmth and the dignity and what this young girl is doing and the love and the devotion and the trust in the eyes of this child, I think there is something so dignified, and even with the child, with who he is, and he's loved and he knows the source of love. The woman right here in the blue, a woman in a market in Guatemala. The oldest woman that I think was probably in the market, and people revered her and respected her and acknowledged her. So obviously she was in part of that earned, perhaps, dignity in a community. This woman right here is the mother of someone who became a very dear friend. and she's from Uganda. I'd hoped that we would have the Princess of Uganda here tonight, but her mother, the Queen Mother, just flew in from Uganda and was exhausted. But this woman right here is a member of that family, and I have been adopted into the tribe, the Toro Kingdom in Uganda. But this woman, just outside of her home, saw a genocide taking place, and it was with Idi Amin, and there were people killed and lying in the streets in front of her home, and they were unable to go out and move the bodies because they were afraid for their own lives. And her youngest daughter, who I got to know in the U.S., she didn't get an education like everyone else in the family because it was unsafe for her to go to school because there was one person robbing a nation and individuals in that nation of dignity. But I think the dignity that this woman shows, and with the wisdom in her eyes, and children in school, the potential of what? And we can see and imagine perhaps what their futures can be. This is a teacher and her student, both with AIDS. They had a very special bond, but they were holding their heads up high and saying, we can beat this. And their school was behind them and very supportive. And so they weren't cast out, they were brought in. And the dignity, and I see a lot right there, especially with that young boy and the potential. Then I'll go over here quickly. For some of the religious leaders in India when it was hot, but they were there serving people that they knew. Two young men, and I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but when you look at your pictures, right here is a flag, and you can see the reflection of this flag on a piece of granite here. And the flag was over across the way. And it was what was not in the picture that made this happen, but what had impacted their lives. And this was at 9/11 on the 5th anniversary. And what wasn't in the picture made it possible for the flag that was across the area to be reflected between these two young men whose lives were forever changed because of that day. This is a gentleman who I loved, and he was a 94-year-old physician from Washington, D.C., in the oldest congregation in Washington. And my husband and I were invited there to be their guests at the inaugural ball for Obama. And the thing that was so absolutely exciting, if you're looking at skin tone, we were the lightest ones there. But nobody noticed one way or the other. We were included in hundreds or decades of history within this congregation. This is a physician that had been waiting all of his life to have people like himself acknowledged in the highest realms of government. He didn't have to say a word, but he smiled all night long with a radiant and wonderful smile. And I think you'll see other things in the book about various types of stories, and I hope you see a story behind each. And the idea of being responsible and telling the stories of people and their lives, whatever their circumstances are. And if you want to talk about any of the other pictures later. I did want to mention one thing because of this location. As we were going through the exhibition upstairs, it reminded me of a gentleman who was a friend of ours in Washington, D.C., who was the only Holocaust survivor to have served in Congress, and his name was Tom Lantos. And Tom Lantos had returned. He's done a lot with human rights. There's an organization in his name that is flourishing now under the auspices of his daughter. But he had traveled to Auschwitz and had spent some time there because he lost family members there. And he came back very, very moved. He'd been working on these issues forever. And I heard about his trip, and I started to think about one picture that I took that was very much about human dignity and it didn't have a person in it. It had a butterfly. Because the story of Auschwitz, that people were so hungry that all of the grass was eaten, any vegetation was eaten, and because there was no vegetation, there were no butterflies. And I had the opportunity of walking through that area. And if you've been there, you know that there are places where there are fragments of bones that had come out of the horror that had been rent upon the location. And you can see the little fragments, but there are some spots there where grass is growing back and wildflowers are growing back. And as I'm standing there, there's a butterfly that comes in and lands on one of the blades of grass. And I get a quick picture, and it's kind of blurry, but you could tell in a way what it was. And I had the opportunity of presenting it to Tom Lantos. And I said, I'm not certain if you'll recognize what this might be, but it's from Auschwitz. And he said, a butterfly. Representing the hope and the work that he has done and the work that so many others have done and trying to advance the dignity that we hope we can all enhance in one another, recognize in one another, and never try to take away from anybody. And that's what I hope my photography has been able to do in many, many ways. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and it has been an honor to work with Brett and to be part of this project because it is reaching into many, many places. And it's much more rewarding for a photographer to have their photos out of the hard drive and being seen. Thank you.
Jaelyn, thank you so much. Thank you for bringing these people to life in front of our very eyes. As you know, when we toured earlier, and I told Brett and Jaelyn that one of the constructs for our exhibition design was to rescue the individual. When you talk about something like the Holocaust where 6 million people were murdered, it's so easy to lose the impact on individual human beings. And so we do that through testimony, but photography is a wonderful way of doing that too. And you've said that you had some mentors who really guided you in this art of depicting human dignity in your subjects. Can you tell us about them a little bit?
Yes, there have been 3 very powerful women that have guided me more into the humanitarian aspect, but that really is part of this whole thing. There is a woman that you may know by the name of Eunice Shriver, and she doesn't live very far from us, and she has worked very hard with aspects of human dignity, especially with disabilities, but with Head Start, with many, 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 many programs. Peace Corps,
Special Olympics,
the whole thing. And she has been a major influence and a mentor in seeing how she pursued things and kept going for a very, very long time. And Padma Van Kataraman, who happens to be the daughter of the former president of India, who has worked very diligently with the leprosy affected, and she has been a mentor. And then a woman by the name of Esther Peterson, who comes from my own religious tradition, who happened to work in Washington, D.C. on behalf of women, and especially after some of the tragedies that had happened in factories and so forth with women working, trying to support their families and being caught in fires and so forth. She also saw the need for nutrition and the need to have mothers understand you don't just fill a stomach, you need to fill a stomach with nutrition. And so if you will look, I guess these bottles don't have it, if anybody's got another container, whenever you see the calories, the whole listing on there, it's because of her. And this is something that is around the world. I haven't been in a country where I've not seen some container with nutritional listing, but it was to help mothers understand how they could wisely spend their money to help their families survive.
Amazing.
So those are my
so
3 mentors.
Blessed to have those mentors, and it sounds like many, many more in your life. now we can count you as our mentor. So I hope we'll continue the conversation. And Brett, let's get back to the declaration that's really affirmed and celebrated in this book. Tell me, I have my answer to this question, but why 70 years after the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was important to basically reaffirm and restate the UDHR through this new declaration?
When we started thinking about human dignity and researching it, what we found is that it had played a really important role in the drafting and the coming to agreement about human rights as they are articulated in the UDHR. When the drafting process began, there were 18 countries that were represented at the drafting table from all over the world. And it was a cacophony of opinions of how to proceed. And the first draft was produced by the secretary of the commission, a man named Humphreys from Canada. And it was a couple hundred pages long. It had footnotes to every rights instrument that had ever been written. And it was just a jumble. And the meetings were very argumentative. There was, of course, the Cold War descending, and the window of opportunity was about to be slammed shut. And it was actually the delegate from China, P.C. Chang, who said, doesn't the preamble to the UN Charter talk about dignity? And it did. And he said, let's start there. Wow. And what happened is the drafting process didn't miraculously and suddenly become easy, but it focused attention and it focused energy and it built bridges in a way that made it possible to reach agreement. And on that cold December night, December 10th, 1948, in Paris, France, it was adopted unanimously by the nations of the world. And this is remarkable because what the UDHR does is it places obligations on states vis-a-vis their own people. And these were state actors that were saying, these are the obligations we owe all people within our jurisdiction in order for us to be a legitimate holder of state authority. And what we sensed 70 years later was that we were once again in a moment where disagreement was high, where some were denying the universality of human rights, others were arguing that they were merely Western impositions upon weaker nations, and we thought that what we really need in our moment is a return to the basic principle that made agreement possible, with the hope that today as well, in our moment, because our job is to bequeath this to the next generation, just as it was bequeathed to us. And so we thought that maybe focusing on human dignity and the many uses of human dignity would be helpful. One of the things that's interesting about human dignity is it plays so many different roles. If you look at Article 1 of the Punta del Este Declaration, it talks about how human dignity is the foundation of human rights, and it is. But it's also the telos, or the end. If you say, why do we have human rights? What are we trying to accomplish? It is the vindication, the implementation of human dignity. But it's also a measure of success. If you want to ask how well is this or that country doing with respect to human rights, there's no better place to start than to say, how is human dignity respected and protected in that country? And so what we thought was that focusing on the many uses of human dignity was a practical way of trying to lower the temperature in human rights discourse and hopefully create broader agreement about human rights globally.
So when the UDHR was passed unanimously, which was an amazing feat, we know that really nothing changed initially because of the UDHR, and not much attention was paid to it for some 40 years. If you could talk to us a little bit about when that started to change, when it started to become part of the discussion, and how you think we might avoid falling into that trap again, with agreeing that, yes, human dignity is something we can all agree on, but practicalities mean we can't focus on it.
Well, the history is interesting, and what happened is as soon as the UDHR was adopted, the Cold War entered into its deep freeze phase, and progress to create a treaty based upon the UDHR. The UDHR wasn't a treaty, it was a United Nations General Assembly resolution, which for international law nerds like me means it's not legally enforceable. You need a treaty to have something that has the force of international law. Well, the process broke down because of the political divide between the Soviet world and the Western world. And that lasted until really the 1970s. And finally, the two parts of human rights, social and economic rights on the one hand, and civil and political rights on the other hand, were divided into two separate treaties. And they were both eventually adopted, and eventually almost unanimously by the world, because the process of depoliticization had made some progress. But it was through the negotiation of the legally enforceable treaties that the progress was halted, that it took such a long time. And it was really due to the Cold War. That was the principal cause. It was in the 1970s that human rights really became an important component of foreign policy. And this was in large measure due to Congressman Lantos that Jaelyn mentioned, and his calling attention to the experience of those who survived the Holocaust and those who lost their lives in the Holocaust. And so it was the Carter administration that sort of made human rights a central component of U.S. foreign policy. And this had a salutary effect and an unsalutary effect. The salutary effect was it raised the profile of human rights in a very significant way. The unsalutary effect was they came to be viewed as a bludgeon that powerful nations used against weaker nations in unprincipled ways, in ways that were essentially political, where friends would be given a pass on human rights violations and enemies would not be given a pass. So that's another thing that we're trying to do, is to reclaim human rights back from state actors. I think that in a way, human rights are much more powerfully advocated through institutions like the Holocaust and Human Rights Museum than by the State Department. They each have a role to play, but I think the more important role is to be played by the social actors, such as us as academics and the museum as an important NGO.
Which, right, everything Eleanor Roosevelt said in writing the UDHR, that human rights are local. They start at home, yeah. Right? And we have to worry about them for ourselves and our communities. And that can't be overseen by state actors. But how do you foresee individuals participating to bring about change? Do we try to get laws enacted, new laws, new treaties, or are there other movements or efforts that you're trying to encourage?
So on the 10th anniversary of the UDHR, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the chairman of the commission that adopted the UDHR, I never learned that in high school, did you? To me, it's remarkable that I never learned that. But Eleanor Roosevelt gave a speech at the United Nations, and she talked about how the implementation of human rights takes place in small places. I think this is what you're citing, isn't it? And she talked about how these places are so small that they're not found on any map of the world. And she talked about the kitchen table as being the place where human rights were taught and would be implemented. And I've come to believe that she was literally correct, that the most important human rights institution in the world is the family. The most powerful advocate for human rights are mothers teaching children. I wish I could say fathers. Let's say mothers and fathers teaching children in an aspirational world. But that is where we learn to respect each other. That's where we learn to respect those who are different from us. And so what I want to do is to try to help return human rights to the kitchen table and to have it be something that is not something we think of primarily as legally enforceable, but something that's going to be largely through non-legal means. Now, it's hard for me to say that because I'm a law professor, right? So we'd like the law to be the solution to every problem. But what we come to learn from the experience of human rights is that it's non-legal means of implementation and vindication that are going to be the most powerful. And so, for example, one of the things we did in the Punta del Este Declaration is we emphasized the ways that human dignity helps us focus on non-legal responses. And one of the things we became convinced of is that virtually everyone has something interesting to say about human dignity if you'll ask them and listen. And so that's why we included statements from about 100 of the signatories, one of which was Congressman Lantos's daughter, Katrina Lantos Sweat. You'll find her quotation in the book as well. And they come from different political perspectives, different religious perspectives, different ideological perspectives. Would it be okay if I just share two?
Sure.
So if you'll open your book to page...
Jaelyn, I promise I'll get to you. Jaelyn wants to jump in.
Okay, I'll be very quick. So
Take your time, this is
page
important.
15 is Andrew Teal, who's a theologian from Oxford University. And he says this, he says, these images of people of different culture, images of affection, of honoring human diversity, and he's talking here of Jaelyn's photographs, remind us that declarations are not about our having a correct argument, but are expressions of value and love. And that is so important because I used to think that arguments are what would convince us of what is true. But I've come to believe that it's stories. So that's the same thing that you're communicating here at this museum. But it's also just statements of value. It's expressions of what we believe. And the Punta del Este Declaration is a group of very different people from very different backgrounds, very different political, religious convictions, coming together and saying, what can we say together in a joint voice about what we believe to be true? And I think there's something quite powerful in that. One other. If you just flip the page over, you'll get a quote from a law professor from Michigan State, a Jewish gentleman who's a good friend of ours and who's worked with us for many years. And this is what he says. He says, human dignity is at the core of what it means to be human. For me, it means the freedom to be who I am and believe what I believe without denying others the same rights. One thing we learned about human dignity is that it tends to elevate discourse. Political discourse often degenerates. It seems to be sort of almost a Newtonian law of politics, that discourse descends. But human dignity actually lifts. It's like the magic of flaps on an airplane. It lifts discourse. And so when we come to see each other with dignity, as having dignity, which is innate, which is inseparable from our humanity, which must not be denied, then we can begin trying to grapple with and solve even very difficult problems. It doesn't solve the problem, but what it does is it puts us in a position to work towards solutions.
Makes so much sense. Thank you. Jaelyn, I know you were wanting to add something.
Well, I'm finding this so very interesting, and one thing that I hadn't mentioned earlier is that because of taking these photos and working around the world, I started to recognize something the more I traveled, that there was a humanitarian crisis playing out in my own home. And I have a son who is now 32, who is on the autism spectrum. And we have a huge crisis in the United States. There were new statistics that came out, and it's over 2% of the population is on the autism spectrum. And it has made me aware, as I have gone around the world, to find out that there are things at home. And sometimes you think, well, is there blood, associated with it? I tend to say wherever there is pain, that pain for the individual is very real, no matter what extent or where they happen to be. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the field of disabilities, but it comes very much back to Brett's point, too, that I think many of these things happen to reside, is almost the oxymoron of looking at politics. All politics is local. And pain is local. It is to the individual. It is to the family. And the measures that we can do, sometimes small measures, can make a huge difference in where things are and where things can be if we look at it in a localized way. And so maybe you don't need to go much further than your own neighborhood to find ways to magnify dignity and provide opportunities so people can manifest their dignity and be productive within community, which benefits all of us. So to have policies are very, very important because we need the thought leaders, but then we need to have the people on the ground. One example with this, and I've used it many times, is the curb cut. And the curb cut was created to help people with disabilities go from one side of the street to the other without tripping. If they were in a wheelchair or whatever it was. But who's using it today? I used it today with my suitcase. And how about vendors, shopping carts, bicycles, all sorts of things. And I think there's a lot of remedies or a lot of solutions that we'll come up with that may help in one area that will help in many other areas that we don't anticipate.
Let's hope so. I could continue talking to you two. It's so inspirational, and but I want to have a little bit of time for audience questions. We said we would be through at 7:30, and it is 7:30, but we're going to keep going for a little bit. We don't take questions directly from the audience, but we ask that you write them on a note card and pass them to our staff, who will collect them and bring them up. While we wait for some questions from the audience, I wonder what you two are thinking about the impact of the pandemic, and the impact on human dignity of nations that don't have access to the vaccine. What is this current state that we are in today doing to impact this effort to really value human dignity throughout the world?
I think that's a huge question. I'm going to jump in for just a moment because my husband happens to be a virologist, and he's been working on these issues for a very, very long time. And I hope the thing that we can do is work with fact. And if we work with fact in many ways, the stories of the individuals telling what their fact and their truth is, right, and getting into things, we could perhaps avoid some of these huge problems. And then it comes down again to the individual.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
What I would add is, when we started this project, we thought human dignity was the central concept, and it is. But you'll notice that the Punta del Este Declaration is human dignity for everyone, everywhere. And it is the everyone, everywhere that is actually quite important as well. And there is something about human dignity that makes it difficult for us to descend into identity politics and tribalism and nationalism. What it does is it says this is a humanity problem and not a this person, this group, that group problem. And that's what I would say human dignity can add to the coronavirus crisis, is that we need to really view this universally and globally, and not view it primarily as a problem of this group or that group.
Right, and we haven't learned that yet, definitely. So I have a couple of questions from the audience. The first is, having lived in a very homogeneous community that has attacked our local school board, I'm concerned about leaving human dignity to the kitchen table. Some thoughts?
Well, the second most important human rights institution are primary schools. The third most important is secondary schools. The next most important is universities. So I think education is very, very important. And if you look at the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's reproduced at the end of the book. What you'll see is the preamble notes that human rights are a shared ambition of all mankind, and they're going to be implemented through step-by-step measures, and education is emphasized as the primary place. And so I think we do need to think about human rights education and have it be a part of our educational programs. And, I think, parents owning the education of their children is important. If we really cared about these issues in our families, we wouldn't be resisting having them taught in our schools. So I see them as linked. But certainly education is a very important human rights institution.
So don't give up on being an active participant, and make sure that your values are heard, and that we are working to promote the values that we want taught in the school.
Yeah, and it's not to say that we're all going to agree on those things, but part of being a democracy is that we come together and try to convince each other and try to work peaceably. And if we're keeping each other's equality, dignity in mind, it's going to help us behave better in those disputes. It's going to help us fight cleaner, if you will. And we need that today. I mean, one of the problems we have is we don't know how to disagree very well. We have sort of coercive attempts to silence disagreement coming from both extremes of the political spectrum, and it's scary, it's disconcerting, especially for people who sort of view themselves as sort of moderates and sort of in the middle on things.
Well, and to get back to the work of the museum, we teach about the process of genocide. I don't believe that we're at risk of a genocide happening in the United States, but the first step is classification, and then symbolization, and then you start to discriminate. And I think you see that throughout the United States right now. People classifying, dividing into camps, and forgetting that we all share the goal of human dignity. So I think this is so important. Maybe it's an answer for us to work through some of these problems. Jaelyn, the question for you about how you identified your subjects. How did you approach them to get their picture? Did you visit with them and sort of learn their story, or did you?
There's a couple of different ways. I have paired with NGOs around the world, and I will go in and I will take pictures, and then I let them have their pictures, and then I keep pictures. And I get in on the front lines because people are doing the tough work with NGOs in various countries, whether it be with leprosy or with women and children's issues or whatever. And what was the other part of that?
Well, if you visited with them, if you really got to know their story,
In
when you
many
take their photos.
situations, I did, but I'm also part of the tradition with Steve McCurry of being a street photographer.
Okay.
Because as you are walking around, you can observe life and you can get in on things. And then very often doors are open and you find dignity and interesting things. I walked into an opium den once and I took probably 40 photos before I even knew what was going on. But the people were so warm and wonderful, and I found out it was a community event.
Wow.
Some interesting things. It was there was a whole set of actions with it. But there's all sorts of interesting things.
Wow.
So it can be walking around a city. It can be going into where there's a particular mission with an NGO.
Opening your eyes.
And opening your eyes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is there anything, or what, if anything, would you change about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a compromise. It was painstakingly negotiated, and it was something that I don't think anyone would have written themselves. And so what I think is interesting about joint voice declarations is that they are efforts to state what we can agree upon, even if we wouldn't say it quite that way ourselves. And honestly, the process of trying to draft the Punta del Este Declaration was difficult, and it almost felt like we were falling into some of the same traps and divisions that beleaguered the process of drafting the UDHR. I'll just share one quick example. Someone suggested, if you look at the very last article of the Punta del Este Declaration, Article 10, it is talking about the most egregious human rights violations and opportunities for addressing and ameliorating human rights issues. And someone said, why don't we say human dignity reminds us to remember the most vulnerable among us? And I was sort of the rapporteur that was taking all these notes, and I thought, great suggestion. So I typed it in, and it was being projected on a screen behind us. And someone raised their hand, and they said, if you put that in, I will not join this declaration. And it took us about a half an hour to figure out why. But the bottom line was, she said, this is code for pro-life ideologues, and I believe in the right to an abortion. And so this is code for the right of the embryo. And I thought to myself, wow, I didn't see that. That's not what I thought of when I thought the most vulnerable among us. And so, I X'd it out. And then someone raised their hand and said, if you take that out, I'm not going to sign this declaration. And it was like, well, why? Well, because we need to protect the rights of the unborn. And so there were people on both sides, and this was important code for a fight that was taking place between them that I was oblivious to. And you can look at Article 10 and search for the rights of the most vulnerable, and you won't find it there because we just had to withdraw from that fight in order to reach agreement. Now, I happen to believe that abortion politics would be very different if we were really focusing on human dignity. If we did recognize the dignity of the unborn child, and if we did recognize the dignity of the mother who might have her own life in jeopardy or might be the victim of rape or of incest or bad decision-making. And I think what we would probably do is all behave a little differently, even on an issue as explosive and as divisive as that, because what we would be pushed towards is finding non-legal solutions and solutions that tried to vindicate the dignity of everyone. I was having a conversation here in Dallas at the Dallas-Fort Worth Religious Freedom Summit of someone who works with pregnant teenagers. And she is an opponent of abortion, but she is spending her time trying to help actual human beings navigate this terrible, terrible situation, this difficult situation that they find themselves in, unwanted pregnancy. And I thought to myself, that's what human dignity does, is it says, I'm not just going to carry a picket and shout and demand to have my way. I'm going to try to help some actual human beings navigate a life crisis. And I'm thinking to myself, if you're pro-choice, maybe there are things you can be doing as well to help actual individual human beings navigate a difficult situation rather than just yelling and shouting. Now, there's a place for yelling and shouting. That's one of the great things about a democracy is we yell and shout, and we permit each other to yell and shout. But what I think human dignity would do, even for an issue as divisive as that, is it would let us not be satisfied with just yelling and shouting. It would encourage us to say, well, given my convictions, what can I do to help a human being through this, this difficult situation?
We're almost out of time. We're actually a little over time, and I appreciate everyone staying with us. But I want to ask one last question that I like to end on, and that's what gives you both hope for real change, for us really focusing on human dignity and starting to change the tide.
I think I'll go back to some of my theological studies. And I have a slightly different view than what some of the theological theologians have said. I don't think man is an enemy to God. I think that people are good and they want to do well and good things on the whole. And I think if we can build on that, because I've seen some people who have been tagged with awful monikers, but that there is something in them that wants to do something that is right. And if we can have those conversations and the conversations that Brenda's talking about, I think it's going to give us more hope. And if we can be positive in our interactions with others and treat others with dignity, I think that's going to send a message, and it may be just one person at a time, but we saw what a virus can do. It can overtake the world. Why can't something positive?
You've asked a serious question, and it's hard to answer in a really brief way. But in a way, for me, it goes back to this story that Jan Fagel had of reaching out to the Pakistanis. And if you find his quote in this book from Jan Fagel, it focuses on building bridges between theistic and non-theistic worldviews. And that's something also that's very powerful about human dignity, because it is something that, for those of us who are religious, we have a view of human dignity that's almost always rooted in our faith tradition. But for Immanuel Kant, for example, his theory of dignity was not religious. It was, philosophical. And I think that what we want to do is we want to find ways of building bridges and ways of overcoming differences that are honest and have integrity. And so that's what I think has drawn me to this concept, is because I think it has the potential to help us overcome differences in ways that are deep and meaningful. For me, human dignity is based in my faith. It's based upon my belief that we are all children of God, created in His image. But you don't have to believe that to care about human dignity, and we can find a lot of grounds for agreement, even if we disagree about the deepest roots of our dignity.
Thank you both so much, Jaelyn, Brett. What an amazing evening. Thank you for the book, for creating it for the world and for giving it to each of us. And I hope it inspires us all to go out and, as we say at the museum, be upstanders in promoting human dignity. Thank you all for being here.